The man sitting across from our camera crew took a long time to agree to this interview. He had been asked before, and each time he had turned away, unable to find the words, unwilling to open the wound. His name is Alexei Vasilyev, and what this man has endured over the course of just a few short years is the kind of grief most people will never come close to understanding. His life, as he describes it, did not simply change. It split in two. There is the world that existed before, and then there is everything after, a long and colorless stretch of days filled with loss, silence, and pain that no amount of time seems to soften. With tears sitting just behind his eyes, Alexei speaks quietly about his only son, Vitaly, a young man he describes as hardworking, kind, and full of promise. He was a good boy, Alexei says. He was a fine young man. And not long after the worst had happened, the wife and daughter of the man responsible appeared at the doorstep of the Vasilyev home, not to offer comfort or remorse, but to confront. The Tarasovs came, Alexei recalls, his voice tightening. The mother and the daughter. They were aggressive right there in the yard. The whole neighborhood saw it. It was a confrontation that only deepened a wound that had never been allowed to close. To understand how any of this came to pass, we have to go back to 2010, to the Kursk region of Russia, to a small city called Kurchatov, a quiet industrial town built around a nuclear power plant, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where families live out their whole lives within a few city blocks of one another. Today, Alexei Vasilyev shares his modest apartment with his elderly mother-in-law, a frail woman who depends on him for nearly everything. He cooks for her, cares for her, tends to her needs with a gentleness that speaks to who he is as a person. Together, these two aging, grieving individuals try to hold each other up, though both will admit their strength is running out. Lord, don't give anyone this kind of grief, the old woman whispers during our visit. What did we do to deserve this? Alexei himself barely manages to hold back the tears that come every time he speaks his son's name. His only son is gone. His wife is behind bars. She acted, she said, out of a mother's desperation, trying to protect the memory and the honor of the child she had lost. Alexei and Svetlana Vasilyev had built a life together that most couples would envy. They had spent decades side by side, grounded in mutual respect and genuine love. Everything between us was built on understanding, Alexei says. We loved each other. Both had careers at the local nuclear power station. Both had poured themselves into raising their son Vitaly, who had become the absolute center of their world. Their devotion to him was deepened by sorrow they had already known. Years earlier, their eldest daughter had died as a child after a long and devastating illness. That loss had never fully healed, and Vitaly had grown up carrying a kind of brightness that both his parents clung to. He was not just their son, he was their reason to keep going. And he had grown into someone worth holding on to. Vitaly Vasilyev was, by every account, a remarkable young man. He did not drink, did not fall in with dangerous crowds, did not waste his youth the way some young men do. He was industrious, capable, caring. He could fix a car engine, do electrical work, handle carpentry and farming with equal ease. He had renovated the family's apartment in a 9-story building almost entirely by himself. Neighbors respected him. Friends trusted him. He was a very decent person, one acquaintance tells us. He worked alongside a lot of young guys around here, and he stood out. For his parents, he was not just a son, he was the sun itself, the warmth and light around which their entire lives orbited. No one could have predicted how suddenly that light would go out. In the summer of 2010, on an otherwise ordinary evening, Vitaly made plans to go fishing with a friend. It seemed like nothing. A small, simple pleasure, but Svetlana Vasilieva remembers the feeling that came over her that night, the kind of instinctive, bone-deep dread that mothers sometimes carry without knowing why. My heart was tearing at me that night, she says. I told my husband, let's go to him, let's tell him not to go, something is warning me. But Vitaly reassured her. He was fine, he was just going fishing, he would be back soon. His friend had suggested a spot he knew, a stretch of water on the grounds of a collective farm called Progress. What Vitaly did not know when they set out was that fishing on that land was not permitted. When they arrived and the situation became clear, Vitaly reportedly wanted to turn around and leave immediately. His companion persuaded him to stay a little longer. That decision, made in a moment of harmless youthful carelessness, would cost him everything. Meanwhile, the farm's security staff had already noticed the intruders and had placed a call to the farm's chairman, a man named Sergei Tarasov. Tarasov was roused from his home in the middle of the night and drove out to confront the trespassers. He did not go empty-handed. He brought a firearm, a rifle-type weapon he carried openly, without any cover or case. According to those who knew him, this was not entirely unusual behavior. He used to carry a sawed-off before, Alexei Vasilyev says slowly. Then he got himself something more like a proper rifle, but he just walked around with it. That's how he was. What happened next defies all reasonable explanation. A grown man, a figure of local authority, the chairman of a significant agricultural operation, confronted two young men who were fishing without permission. In a civilized world, the response to that would be a firm warning, perhaps a call to local law enforcement, or at most, a demand that they leave the property immediately. What Tarasov chose to do instead was something that cannot be justified by any standard of human decency. He fired the weapon at Vitali. The first shot struck the young man's fingers. Even wounded, even bleeding, Vitali attempted to reason with him. "Why are you shooting?" he reportedly said. "Just tell us to leave and we'll go." "We're already leaving. I've already packed up the gear." But Tarasov did not stop. He did not lower the weapon. He stepped closer, and at point-blank range he fired again, then once more. Vitaly Vasiliev collapsed to the ground. "One shot, then another," his father says, his voice barely above a whisper. "And that was it. My boy fell." In the moments that followed, Tarasov reportedly attempted to construct a justification for what he had done. He claimed self-defense. But the physical evidence told a different story entirely. The wounds were not consistent with a confrontational attack. Vitaly had been struck from behind in the shoulder and back. How could he claim self-defense? Alex asks, his grief curdling into disbelief. "He shot him in the back, in the shoulder. My son was like a little bird. He was harmless." Vitaly Vasiliev was 24 years old. He had not caught a single fish that night. He had done nothing that warranted what was done to him. The community around Kurchatov reacted with shock and outrage. People who had known Vitaly since he was a child, who had worked alongside him, who had watched him grow up, could not make sense of it. "How?" one neighbor asks, her voice cracking. "How do you take a child's life over a fish he didn't even catch?" For Alexei and Svetlana, the grief that descended on them was total and consuming. The kind of grief that doesn't arrive in waves but settles in permanently, changing the very texture of daily life. Svetlana, in the days and weeks that followed, lost all sense of why she was still alive. Her only remaining child was gone. Every morning felt like an accusation. Every room in the house held a memory. "He was everything," she says of Vitaly. "He could cook, he could sew, he could do the electrical work, he could handle the farm. He was like the sun shining over us, and then a black cloud covered it all." The weight of that darkness became unbearable. Desperate, shattered, unable to see any future worth living for, Svetlana made a decision that nearly ended her life. She stepped in front of an approaching train. Miraculously, she survived, though the injuries she sustained were severe and lasting. She was rushed to a hospital, where surgeons worked for many hours to save her. She emerged from that experience physically broken, walking only with the aid of crutches, but alive. In the meantime, Sergei Tarasov faced justice in a court of law. He was tried, found guilty of the killing, and sentenced to 7 years in a strict regime correctional facility. For many in Kurchatov, even this felt inadequate, and information emerged during the proceedings that made it feel even more so. It came to light that Tarasov had previously fired a weapon at another person in 2002. That individual had survived, but the incident had been quietly dropped after the victim unexpectedly withdrew his complaint. Svetlana and those close to her suspected that Tarasov had used either intimidation or financial leverage to make the matter disappear. The pattern of behavior, they believed, had been allowed to continue unchecked. "He was already hunting people," one community member says. And they forgave him. It was reported that following Vitaly's death, Tarasov's associates approached the Vasiliev family with a substantial sum of money, said to be around 500,000 rubles, in an apparent attempt to discourage them from pursuing the case. Svetlana refused without hesitation. "I told them I would not sell my son," she says. With Tarasov behind bars, the Vasiliev family entered a period of prolonged, suffocating grief. Svetlana could not eat. Her husband fed her with a spoon as one would a small child. Her legs, under the toll of constant psychological anguish and physical trauma, eventually gave out entirely. For a period that stretched over many weeks, she could not walk at all. Alexei became her caretaker, her nurse, her anchor, handling every task alone while watching his wife deteriorate day by day. She stopped going to work. She stopped participating in social life. Every holiday, every celebration, every moment of community joy became a reminder of what she no longer had. "Other families go to celebrations, to see relatives," she says quietly. "We go to the cemetery with flowers, that's where we go." A portrait of Vitaly stood in the corner of the apartment, and no one could bring themselves to move it. This went on for 6 years. 6 years of daily tears, of grief that refused to recede, of mornings that offered nothing but the long, aching absence of the boy she had loved more than her own life. Friends and neighbors watched helplessly. "Every time I called her, she was crying," one close acquaintance tells us. "She always said life was over for her." No one disputed it. Everyone in that small city understood, even if they could not fully share, the depth of what Svetlana was carrying. And then came the day that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium remained. Svetlana walked into a local store and stopped cold. Coming toward her, arm in arm with his wife, smiling casually as though the world owed him nothing, was Sergei Tarasov. He was supposed to be in prison. He was supposed to be serving his sentence. Instead, he was here in the open, in the town where he had taken her son's life, apparently unbothered and unashamed. What had happened was this: Tarasov, reportedly for demonstrating good behavior within the penal system, had been transferred to a colony settlement, a lower security arrangement that permitted weekend home visits. He was tending to livestock at the facility, described as a model inmate, and on certain weekends he was allowed to return home. To Svetlana, this was incomprehensible. "What do you mean, a leave of absence?" she says, her voice rising with a grief that has turned to fury. "He committed premeditated killing and he gets a holiday. While she walked on crutches, while she buried her days in sorrow, the man who had destroyed her family was out in the world, living something that resembled a normal life. The anger that had been quietly building for years reached a breaking point. That was when a kind of light appeared to me," she says, in words that chill even as they come from a place of raw, recognizable pain. "My son wasn't protected, so let them suffer the way we are suffering. Let his parents cry the way I cry." A plan began to form in her mind, one that consumed her thoughts completely. She would hire someone to carry out retribution, and she determined that the most devastating punishment she could deliver was not to target Tarasov himself, but to take from him what he had taken from her. She would target his son, a young man named Oleg Tarasov. Over the months that followed, Svetlana Vasilieva gathered money with fierce, quiet determination. Every spare ruble, every kopeck she could set aside, she saved. She researched and observed. She learned Oleg Tarasov's routine, his workplace, his vehicle, the names of people close to him. She then began cautiously reaching out, seeking someone willing to carry out the act in exchange for payment. She eventually made contact with an individual she believed could help her, arranging meetings in which she handed over personal details about Oleg: his home address, his schedule, the car he drove, the girl he was seeing, his family situation. She agreed to pay 60,000 rubles for the contract, providing a portion up front as an advance. What Svetlana did not know was that law enforcement had already been watching her. Operatives had received information that a local woman was searching for a hired contractor to carry out violence against a specific individual. A covert operation was set in motion. The person Svetlana ultimately met and negotiated with was not a hired criminal at all. He was an undercover police officer, carefully playing the role. And the moment it became clear that Svetlana was serious and committed to seeing her plan through, investigators made a critical decision. They would need Oleg Tarasov himself to temporarily vanish. Oleg was quietly pulled aside during what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. An officer approached his vehicle and, after checking his documents, told him something no young man expects to hear: that his life was in danger and that he would need to cooperate with a police operation. Oleg agreed. For the next several days, he lived in a safe house, completely cut off from his family and friends, having told no one where he was or what was happening. His car was left abandoned in a forested area outside town, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition, documents and personal belongings still inside. Everything was arranged to look as though something terrible had happened to him. Reports of a missing young man began circulating almost immediately. The community buzzed with alarm. And to make the operation as convincing as possible, photographs were taken of Oleg in staged conditions, posed in a way that was meant to suggest to Svetlana that the act had been completed. These images were loaded onto Oleg's own phone and later shown to her as supposed proof. When she heard that Oleg had disappeared and saw what appeared to be confirmation, she reached back out to the undercover officer to arrange final payment. It was at that meeting, in a prearranged location, that police moved in and arrested her. The scene at the arrest was chaotic in its own quiet way. The undercover officer, when he spotted her approaching, briefly ran in the wrong direction before realizing she was the woman he had been expecting. Svetlana, when confronted by officers, initially attempted to maintain some level of distance from the situation, denying she recognized the man she had been dealing with, but the evidence was overwhelming. Officer provided a full account of their transactions, the negotiation, the advance payment, the detailed information she had provided about Oleg. In his possession were the funds she had most recently handed over, wrapped in an envelope. On his phone were the photographs taken during the staged disappearance. The case against her was clear and complete. When the full scope of what had happened became known to the community, the reaction was complicated. People were horrified, but they were also deeply conflicted. Many privately could not bring themselves to condemn Svetlana entirely. "Not one person here judged her," says someone who knew her well. "Not one woman, not one man. As a human being, as a mother, you can understand what drove her. But as a mother, she also should not have done it." The sentiment captured the impossible tension of the situation. A woman consumed by grief, broken by loss, watching what she perceived as injustice play out before her, had crossed a line that no amount of sympathy could erase. Svetlana was taken into custody and later subjected to a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, conducted at the Serbsky Center, one of Russia's most established forensic psychiatric institutions, located in Moscow. A panel of experts determined that while she was not fully incapacitated by mental illness, she did exhibit certain psychological disturbances, described in part as an obsessive fixation, a consuming and relentless preoccupation that had overtaken rational judgment. These findings were factored into sentencing. She was ultimately convicted of solicitation to commit a violent act and sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment, accompanied by a requirement for ongoing psychiatric supervision. Meanwhile, for the Tarasov family, the revelation that Svetlana had targeted their son sent shockwaves through their household. Oleg emerged safely from the safe house after the operation concluded, physically unharmed but deeply shaken by what he had learned. His father, Sergei Tarasov, upon being informed of the full scope of what had been planned, reportedly stated that while he could at some level understand a grieving parent's rage being directed at him, he could find no justification for any harm being directed at his son, who had played no part in what had happened. His wife, Oleg's mother, reacted with anger that overflowed in directions beyond the Vasilyev family. She confronted a longtime friend of the Vasilyevs, a woman named Galina Mesnianikina, in public repeatedly and aggressively, blaming anyone she associated with the plot. She wouldn't leave me alone, Galina tells us. Every time she saw me anywhere, she would come at me, call me names. She was everywhere. As for Alexei Vasilyev, who had known nothing of his wife's plan, he found himself simultaneously losing her to prison and struggling to process what she had been carrying alone for so long. She never told me anything, he says quietly, the hurt and bewilderment still visible years later. She kept it all inside herself. In prison, something in Svetlana shifted. The burning certainty that had driven her, that sense of righteous, consuming purpose, began to give way to something softer and more difficult. Reflection, regret. She had wanted Oleg Tarasov's parents to feel what she felt. She had wanted them to know her pain. But she came to understand, gradually and painfully, that Oleg himself had done nothing wrong. He had not been there that night on the riverbank. He had not pulled the trigger. He had not stolen her son's future. He was simply a young man living his life, and she had tried to take that life away. I wanted them to feel my pain, she says in the stillness of looking back, but now I understand that maybe I was wrong. And then, with a sincerity that seems to come from the deepest part of what she has left, she adds the words that perhaps surprise her most of all. I am glad he is alive. I am truly grateful to God that it turned out this way. What remains in the wake of all of this is a portrait of grief so profound it became dangerous, of a system that moved both too slowly and too quickly, of ordinary people crushed under the weight of extraordinary loss. Vitaly Vasilyev was 24 years old when his life was taken on a summer night over a dispute that should never have become anything more than a minor inconvenience. His father tends to an elderly woman in a quiet apartment and tries to get through each day. His mother serves a prison sentence and carries the knowledge of what she nearly did. And somewhere in Kurchatov, a young man named Oleg Tarasov is still alive, probably still trying to make sense of the night he staged his own disappearance and the story that led to it. No verdict, no sentence, no act of revenge could bring back what the Vasilyev family lost, and nothing ever will.